And welcome back. Now consider this scenario. Two labels sitting side by side on an app. You have enabled constraints to pin the labels to the sides of the container. Now you rotate your phone into the landscape mode. The labels should stretch to fill the screen, right? Do they? If yes, which one or ones? Now let's take another scenario. You have an image and button one beneath the other on an app. Once again, constraints are enabled to pin the elements to the sides of the container. And again you rotate the phone into the landscape mode. Something has to compress, right? Which element or elements compress? To get a better sense of these questions, this video will focus on constraint priorities. In particular, we will focus on content hugging and compression resistant priorities. So, over to Xcode. Once again, we'll create an Xcode project, a single view application. We'll call it Goldilocks because we want to get things right. The language will be Swift, the device the iPhone. Let's click Next. Let's create this project. And now we go to the main storyboard section. And on our storyboard, we highlight this view controller, go to the file inspector. And as you can see, we have got AutoLayout and size classes. We disable size classes, keeping size classes just for the iPhone family. Right, so now let's go to the object library and drag and drop a couple of labels onto our canvas. So here's the first label. So let's stretch it out a bit. For that, I'm going to go to the class inspector, look at its width, change it from 142 to 135. Now let's take this label and position it towards the left container margin and create a duplicate label and position it to the right container margin. So as you can see, there's a little bit of gap between the labels. Now I'm going to go to the attribute inspector of the first label and change its background colors just so that things are a bit more obvious. So make it green. And also do the same for the right label, change its background color to blue. Great. So as you can see out here in the document editor, both these labels are under the main super view. So let's close the navigation editor and add some constraints to the label. So I'm going to take this first label and pin it to the top of the top layout guide. And do the same for the right label. Create a vertical spacing to the top layout guide. Similarly, pin this left label to the left container margin. And create a leading space and do a trailing space for the right label to the right container margin. And lastly, create a horizontal spacing between both labels. So as you can see, I've not specified the dimensions of the labels per se, but just constraints with respect to the label and its boundaries. So we have an error out here, so let's go and check it out. It says content priority ambiguity. So just keep that at the back of your mind, priority ambiguity. Right, so let's trigger the simulator. And this is how our labels look like for the iPhone 6 in portrait mode. You might notice that one of the labels, the blue one, is a bit lengthier than the green one. Let's also check out things in the landscape mode. So yes, this is much more obvious. So as you can see, the blue label has stretched at the expense of the green label. So why has that happened? And what if we want the green label to have stretched instead of the blue label? Perhaps it's something to do with the content priorities that we saw earlier. So let's first stop our simulator and highlight the blue label and go to the size inspector. And let's scroll down a bit. So here you can see the constraints. And if you scroll down a bit more, you see two titles. One is the content hugging priority, and there are two fields below it. And same for the much lengthier content compression resistance priority. So in this video, we're going to focus on the content hugging priority. And as you can see, both the horizontal and vertical values are 251 for our blue label. So let's go ahead and check the values for the green label. And as you can see, they are the same. So in order to solve our problem, we have to understand this content hugging priority values. So let's focus on the horizontal content hugging priority values because our labels are positioned horizontally. Now in order to understand this concept, let's see if this mnemonic helps. So imagine the green and blue labels as two hugging couples. And this value of 251 represents the intensity of that hug. So the green couple have a hugging intensity of 251. Now let's look at the value of the blue couple. That also, as you can see, is 251. Now what if we decrease the intensity of the hugging priority for a couple? Obviously, it will be easier to separate them. So the same logic applies for the label. If the hugging priority is lesser, it is easier for that label to stretch horizontally. So let's assume we want the green label to stretch at the expense of the blue label when, for example, the screen moves into landscape mode. So obviously I'll go to the green label and decrease the value of the horizontal hugging priority. By how much, you say? I guess all you need to do is make this a lower value than the other label. So I'm going to change the value to 250. And of course the blue label stays at 251. So now, as you can immediately see, our errors have, the color has turned to orange out here. So let's go and see what it tells us. So at this point, we have got some misplaced views. So that happens because we have changed our constraint, but our views or our frames have not been updated. So we can quickly fix that out here itself. So let's click on this button out here. And the system helpfully tells us that the frames need to be updated. And all we need to do is fix misplacement, I think, right? And as you can see, the frames on the interface builder have grown accordingly. And now let's do a preview. And this time our green label has grown, both in the portrait as well as landscape mode. Okay, now let's quickly reverse things. Let's make our blue label grow at the expense of the green label. So I'm going to just change this back to its default value of 251 and change this to 250. And again, we need to fix the misplaced views. Click on Fix Misplacement. And let's trigger our simulator once again. And there we have it. The blue label has grown, both in the portrait as well as the landscape mode. Right, now it's time to go to our final topic for this lesson, which is content compression resistant priority, which is quite a mouthful really, but it's quite straightforward and we'll understand that. So I've started by clearing all the entities on my canvas. As you can see, you have a plain canvas out here, and onto this canvas we're going to drag and drop a few entities. So let's basically go to the object library, and we'll start by adding a label to our canvas. So essentially we are creating a small little app or creating the structure for a little app that will automatically show the user a flag on the screen, and the user can guess the country to which the flag belongs to and check their answer and move on to the next question. So of course we won't get into the code, but just keep things static. So as you can see, I've dragged a label, an image view, a text field and a button. So let's change the label and we'll call it Guess the Flag. Let's stretch things a bit. And let's go to the button and change its title to Check. Now for this image view, for this session, basically I'm going to create a static image. So I've already stored the flag of England out here in my assets class. So let's go here to this image view and add this flag of England. And I'm also going to highlight these two entities out here, stretch them down a bit, and also pull this image a bit lower, or stretch this image a bit, and also to the sides of the container, or to the margins of the container rather, and also move this title in the middle and also stretch this text field to the side margins. And for good measure, let's move it down a bit and also move this button. Great. So at this point I'm quite happy with the way my items are structured on the screen. But just one thing, I'll also change the image mode to aspect fit, which I think is a bit better. So the way things are, let's highlight all these entities. And as I said, I'm happy with the vertical spacing. So let's go onto the spin button out here and these two constraints. So just make a note, you have automatically it's selected the multiple constraints out here, as you can see. So I'm just going to set the a constraint to the top neighbor and bottom neighbor for all the entities in the screen. So essentially selecting multiple constraints. So I'm not working on the side constraints, just the vertical constraints. So select this and add these 5 constraints. As you can see, at the moment we haven't set the horizontal constraints, just the vertical ones. Right, now we have to cater for these horizontal constraints too. So let's start with this label out here. So I'm going to go to the Align button and select horizontally in container. So basically this label is in the middle of the container. And let's also select this text field and button, go back to the Align and select and put both these items in the center of the container. Now for the image view, I'm going to stretch it out to either sides of the margin. So let's create a trailing space to container margin and a leading space to container margin. And even let's do the same for the text field. Those in the center, let's create a trailing space and a leading space so that it stretches to the corners of the margin in both portrait and landscape mode. If you cast your attention to the document editor out here, you see that there are some errors, but let's ignore that for the moment and trigger the simulator for an iPhone 6. So here's our canvas in the portrait mode, things pretty much as we wanted them to be. And here's the landscape mode. So are things looking okay? Well, the flag has compressed a bit. Oh no, but we have a missing component out here. We do not have our text field. Let's go back to portrait. There we are, our text field, and suddenly in landscape mode, it disappears. Let's try it once again. Portrait mode with the text field, landscape mode, no text field. So we got to fix this. So let's stop the simulator. So now I think it makes sense to go back and see what our error was. So our error again concerned content priority ambiguity. So let's hold that thought again. And I think at this point I also want to show you another way to preview our storyboards. So we could have used the simulator, but I could also go here to the assistant editor and click on this button out here, and we have a preview. So there we are. So by default it is showing me the preview of our storyboard for an iPhone 4-inch in the portrait mode. But I could go to this plus button out here and let's click on iPhone 4-inch, and as you can see, it immediately created a landscape mode edition. So as you can see, I could have multiple previews for different versions of the iPhone. So let's now close this assistant editor section, open up the utilities section, and also open up the document editor out here and focus on these errors. So once again, we have a content priority ambiguity error. So keep that at the back of your mind, and let's go back here to our view controller and highlight this image view and go to the size inspector and scroll down. So this time we are going to focus on the content compression resistance priority. So as you can see, we have got a horizontal value and a vertical value, and both are 750. So basically, this value controls the degree of resistance to compression. So a larger value would mean more resistance to compressing either horizontally or vertically. Now, for this example, we have got a label, which is the title, we've got an image, we've got a text field and a button. So among all these entities, if anything has to shrink, I would like the flag to shrink. So essentially, and that's in the landscape mode. So moving from portrait to landscape. So basically that's a vertical compression. So what I'm going to do is change the value of the vertical compression priority to something lower. So if the default value is 750, I'm going to make it any lower value. In this case, I'll change the value to 749. And as you can see, the other values are 750. So this is a lower value. And now let's test things out. And remember that this is for the vertical compression. But before we run the simulator, let's fix these issues out here. So we've got misplaced views. So we saw how to fix them earlier. So I'm just going to click on the fix misplacement button, and that should do the trick. Great. And one more. Okay, so things fixed. Let's go back to the document editor and trigger the simulator. So this is our screen in the portrait mode, and it was fine before too, but let's look at the landscape mode. Fine, great. So this time we have our text field. I think as an exercise, you could also do a preview for other versions of the iPhone and check whether things are appearing properly.